Open Book Miss Marple and the Ghostly Typewriter. Chapter 1. The Quiet Village of St. Mary Mead. The village of St. Mary Mead, at first glance, had the air of a picture postcard. Narrow lanes wound lazily between rows of cottages, each with its carefully tended garden. A splash of hollyhocks here, a line of lavender there. Smoke curled from chimneys even in early spring, and the church spire stood tall over the fields as if to remind everyone of order and constancy. To an outsider it was tranquil, almost idyllic, but those who had lived long in the village knew better. St. Mary Mead was not merely a cluster of houses. It was a living organism, its veins pumping gossip instead of blood, and its heart beating with secrets tucked neatly behind lace curtains. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her accustomed chair by the front window of her neat little cottage, had spent a lifetime observing that organism. At 80 years of age, she had mastered the art of appearing a harmless, fluttery old lady while her eyes missed nothing. She was knitting, as she so often was, a serviceable gray scarf destined for one of her nephews. Yet the needles clicked automatically. Her true attention was focused outward, on the comings and goings of the village lane. A stranger had arrived, and nothing stirred St. Mary Mead quite so much as fresh material for speculation. The stranger was Mr. Lionel Carroway, a London novelist of modest fame who had recently taken up residence at the old Grange house. The Grange had been empty nearly 10 years, its ivy-clad walls sagging under neglect. Children dared each other to creep up its drive on moonless nights, swearing they saw pale faces at the windows. When news spread that it had been purchased by a writer, the reactions were divided. Some thought it wonderfully romantic, others muttered darkly about disturbing what ought to be left in peace. Carroway himself was a curious figure. Tall, slightly stooped, with an abundance of dark hair and eyes that seemed to burn with restless energy. He was polite when addressed but gave the impression of a man whose thoughts were always elsewhere, a habit that villagers interpreted as either genius or rudeness, depending on their disposition. His trunks had included, most notably, an ancient, heavy typewriter, which was carried into the Grange study under much grunting from the removal men. Within days, the sound of its clattering keys began to echo through the lanes at improbable hours. Mrs. Price Ridley, a woman whose appetite for sensational stories was matched only by her certainty in their truth, was the first to circulate a theory. "My nephew heard it," she announced to anyone within earshot at the post office. "Typing. At midnight, no less. Going at a furious pace," he said, though not a soul was seen moving about. "Mark my words, that house is troubled. Everyone knows Edward Denholm never found peace there." Edward Denholm. The name was enough to hush a room. He had been a failed novelist who once resided at the Grange. His books, according to Miss Marple's recollection, had been overwrought romances full of sighs and melodrama. Denholm had died under ambiguous circumstances. Found slumped at his desk, a half-finished manuscript before him. Some whispered he had taken his own life in despair. Others said a weak heart had claimed him. What all agreed upon was that the man had never achieved recognition, and that the Grange had brooded ever since. Soon the tale grew wings. A delivery boy swore he had seen light flickering in the study on a night when Carroway was away in London. Another villager claimed he had heard not just typing, but faint muttering voices, as if someone were dictating passages to an unseen secretary. Mrs. Hartnell, the grocer's wife, hinted that words appeared on the machine of their own accord, predicting calamities yet to come. Miss Marple listened to all of it with polite interest and stored the details away. She had never known a ghost to be much of a typist, but she had known plenty of men and women to use superstition as a cloak for mischief. Her philosophy was simple. Wickedness, not specters, accounted for the vast majority of strange happenings. Still, she could not deny that the story held a certain fascination. That afternoon she was visited by Mrs. Bantry, a dear friend from Gossington Hall. Bursting into the cottage with her usual vigor, Mrs. Bantry wasted no time. "Jane, have you heard? Absolutely shocking. Typing at midnight, lights in empty rooms. I dare say it gives one the shivers. George says I'm being fanciful, but really, I can't shake the feeling there's something not quite right about that place." Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "My dear, inspiration often arrives at inconvenient hours. Many writers do their best work long after the rest of us are tucked up in bed." Yes, But what about when Mr. Carroway isn't even home? Young Tom Pritchard swears he saw the curtains pulled back and the keys moving by themselves. I don't say I believe in ghosts, but, well, it's unsettling. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Boys have a talent for embroidery, especially when it earns them attention. Still, it's curious. They discussed the matter over tea, and when Mrs. Bantry had gone, Miss Marple took her evening walk. She passed the gates of the Grange, pausing to observe. The house loomed large, its rooflines jagged against the fading sky. Lights glowed faintly in the study window. And yes, there it was, the unmistakable rattle of typing, quick and insistent. She listened a while, her face unreadable. Then she moved on, though her mind lingered. Why should a man choose such a laborious old machine when modern conveniences were available? Why work at such feverish hours? And if the stories of typing in his absence were true, who benefited from spreading them? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple poured herself a modest glass of sherry and jotted a note in her little book. When people speak of ghosts, they rarely look for the living hand that casts the shadow. She closed the book with a snap. Experience had taught her that mysteries in St. Mary Mead were seldom what they seemed. Somewhere behind the clatter of that typewriter, she felt certain, was not a spirit but a very human motive. And human motives, she reflected, were often far more dangerous than any ghost. Chapter 2. The Arrival of Mr. Carroway. The morning that Mr. Lionel Carroway arrived in St. Mary Mead was one of those brisk English mornings that promised spring without quite delivering it. The hedgerows were still bare, but daffodils had begun to poke tentative green shoots through the soil. By 8 o'clock the entire village was abuzz, for word had traveled that the writer was coming to take possession of the Grange. In a community like St. Mary Mead, such an event was not simply news. It was theater, and every villager was eager for a front-row seat. From her window, Miss Marple observed the scene with quiet amusement. 2 removal lorries rumbled up the lane, their sides painted with the name of a London firm. The drivers, gruff men in heavy coats, whistled as they struggled with bulky trunks and unwieldy crates. Among the items that drew particular interest was a massive oak desk, polished but scarred with age, and an even heavier iron-framed typewriter that took 4 men to maneuver up the drive. The children who had gathered nearby pointed and whispered, as though it were a relic from some ancient civilization. Miss Marple, her eyes sharper than most gave her credit for, noted how carefully the typewriter was handled. Not just with caution for its weight, but almost with reverence. One of the men even muttered, "Hope the thing doesn't start clacking on its own." His companion gave a nervous laugh. The remark, thrown casually into the air, landed quickly in the ears of Mrs. Price Ridley, who wasted no time repeating it to anyone within reach. By the time the typewriter was placed in the Grange study, it was already half a ghost story. Then came Carroway himself. He arrived not in a grand motor car, as some had imagined, but in a modest black saloon that bore the marks of many miles. He stepped out with the air of a man accustomed to being stared at, though not always approvingly. Tall, with narrow shoulders, his dark overcoat hung loosely on his frame, suggesting a neglect of meals or perhaps of health. His hair, thick and unruly, fell into eyes that seemed both weary and watchful. He removed his hat politely when addressed, but his smile appeared perfunctory, as though conversation were a formality rather than a pleasure. Yes, I'm Mr. Carroway," he told Mr. Tompkins, the station porter who had trudged up to offer assistance. "Thank you, but I believe the men have managed." His voice was deep but clipped, betraying the habits of one used to speaking more on paper than aloud. Villagers lingered at their gates, pretending to prune roses or sweep doorsteps, though their eyes rarely left the drive of the Grange. Within the hour, Mrs. Bantry had called at Miss Marple's cottage, cheeks flushed with excitement. "Jane, I've seen him with my own eyes. Such a peculiar-looking man, like someone out of one of those French novels. And the way he looked about him, as though the whole village were beneath his notice." Miss Marple smiled faintly over her teacup. Writers often live more in their heads than in their surroundings. One mustn't take it as rudeness. Perhaps, but there's something odd about him, I say. Did you see that dreadful old typewriter? Why, it looks more suited to a museum than a study. And it makes the most appalling racket. I heard it clattering away as I passed just now, So fast, too. My dear, I should think no ordinary man could type at that speed. Miss Marple's needles clicked gently. Practice makes for quick fingers, my dear. Though I confess, it does seem rather vigorous for a gentleman who appears so wan. As days passed, Carroway's presence settled over the village like a cloud of smoke that refused to disperse. He was rarely seen in daylight except on brief walks to the grocer or the post office. When he did appear, he purchased items with distracted efficiency. Packets of tea, an excess of paper, ink in quantities that surprised even the shopkeeper. He spoke little, and when pressed into conversation, seemed eager to return to his work. Yet the nights were another matter. Time and again, villagers swore they heard the hammering clatter of his machine, echoing across hedges and fields. Some claimed it began precisely at midnight and ended with the crow of the cockerel. Others insisted it was erratic, starting and stopping as though two hands, not one, competed for the keys. More than one villager remarked that they had glimpsed him in town during those same hours, an impossibility, unless the typewriter truly was working of its own accord. The effect of these tales was to heighten curiosity to fever pitch. At the Blue Boar Inn, patrons exchanged elaborate theories. "He's writing some devilish book, that's what," muttered old Mr. Sedgwick. "Words no honest Christian should put on paper." Mrs. Hartnell, overhearing, insisted the machine was cursed, for she'd noticed strange marks upon the ribbons of paper. Marks like claw scratches, she claimed. It was into this atmosphere that Miss Marple stepped one afternoon, on her way back from the churchyard. At the post office she found a small crowd gathered, their attention fixed upon Mr. Carroway himself, who was sending a thick envelope by registered post. His expression was one of barely contained irritation, as though he disliked being observed but could hardly avoid it. When Mrs. Price Ridley inquired politely if he was settling in, he merely inclined his head and said, "I find it quiet enough for my purposes," before striding away. Purposes. Mrs. Price Ridley repeated with relish once he was out of earshot. What sort of purposes, I wonder? Nothing wholesome, I'll be bound. Miss Marple, collecting her letters, made no comment. But she could not help noting that the envelope Carroway had posted was unusually heavy, the address written in a hand so cramped it looked almost encrypted. She tucked the observation away. That evening, as twilight deepened, she paused by the gate of the Grange once more. A lamp burned in the study window. She fancied she could hear the faint rattle of keys, like bones clattering in a drawer. The sound was steady, insistent, almost feverish. Yet when she glanced at her watch, she realized it was scarcely 7 o'clock. A curious hour for such intensity. Returning home, she found her maid, Gladys, full of chatter. "Begging your pardon, miss, but I met Mary Sims, and she swears she passed the Grange this afternoon and heard voices arguing inside. Loud, they were, shouting like. But when she looked in, only Mr. Carroway was there, and he was as quiet as you please, bent over that machine. Voices, Gladys?" "Yes, Mississippi. And Mary doesn't make things up, not like some. She said it fair gave her the creeps." Miss Marple made no reply. But later, alone with her notebook, she wrote, "If there is more than one voice in the house, it will not be a ghost's. Someone is listening or dictating." The words underlined themselves in her mind. Mr. Carroway might have come seeking solitude, but solitude, Miss Marple suspected, was the last thing he would find in St. Mary Mead. Chapter 3 Whispers in the Study. The Grange had always been a house that drew whispers, but since Mr. Carroway's arrival, the whispers had become louder, more insistent, and far more imaginative. If one lingered at the baker's shop or stopped by the vicarage gate, one would hear all manner of accounts. Voices in empty rooms, lights flashing in windows where no lamp was lit, shadows moving behind curtains when the owner was away. And now, most curious of all, there were tales of words appearing on the typewriter that no living hand admitted to writing. Miss Marple, seated with her embroidery on a crisp Tuesday afternoon, received her first close account of such phenomena from her maid, Gladys. Gladys had been sweeping the garden path when she stopped to chat with Lily, a girl who worked part-time at the Grange. Lily, wide-eyed and shivering as though the words themselves were cold, had told her that while she was dusting the study one morning, she distinctly heard a murmur, low, urgent, like someone muttering a string of instructions. She had thought it was Mr. Carroway dictating, but when she looked up, He was across the room, bent silently over his typewriter, his lips firmly shut. "And she swears to it, miss," Gladys insisted, setting down her broom as though to underline the truth. "She said she near dropped the duster." The words came from right behind her, plain as day, though no one was there. Miss Marple's expression was mild, almost placid. "What sort of words, Gladys?" Lily didn't say. Only that it was a man's voice, quick and sharp. She bolted out before hearing more. Miss Marple nodded. Fear has a way of lending clarity to one's memory. It is possible, of course, she mistook the rustle of papers or the tapping of the keys for speech. Gladys pursed her lips. "She doesn't think so, Mississippi. She says she'll not go back, not if they pay her double. Says the Grange gives her the horrid shivers." That evening, Miss Marple recounted the matter to Mrs. Bantry, who had dropped by with a fresh batch of scones. Mrs. Bantry, naturally, was delighted. "You see, Jane, I told you the house was queer. Ghosts dictating chapters to a poor, worn-out author. It's exactly the sort of thing one reads about in magazines." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Yes, my dear, but in magazines one seldom asks who might benefit from frightening away servants." Mrs. Bantry gasped. "You mean someone could be doing it deliberately? But why?" "Why indeed?" Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking. "It is always wise to ask who profits by a situation. Ghosts, you see, rarely have bank accounts." Meanwhile, the whispers in the village grew darker. Mr. Pritchard, the blacksmith, claimed that while passing the Grange at dusk, he heard a distinct cry for help. He rushed to the gate, only to find the house silent, the study lamp glowing serenely as though nothing were amiss. Mrs. Hartnell swore she had seen a figure in the window, tall and pale, with hands that seemed unnaturally long. Even the vicar's wife, a woman not prone to fancy, confessed she felt uneasy walking past the lane after nightfall. The gossip reached fever pitch when Mr. Carroway himself was overheard at the Blue Boar, speaking sharply to the innkeeper. "I will not have the villagers loitering about my property," he declared. "This absurd fascination with my house must cease. I came here for quiet, not for intrusion." His words, clipped and stern, did little to soften the suspicion that already clung to him. Miss Marple, hearing the account from her friend Mrs. Price Ridley the next morning, noted quietly that irritation was often a shield for fear. But fear of what? The answer, or at least a piece of it, arrived sooner than expected. Late one night, as the moon hung pale above the fields, young Tom Pritchard dared his companions to creep up to the Grange gates. They had scarcely reached the hedge when the sound reached them, typing, furious and relentless, as though the machine itself were possessed. But over the clatter came something stranger still, a whispering voice, indistinct but undeniably present, like a hiss of breath-shaping words that the boys could not quite catch. One of the lads swore he heard the phrase, "She knows too much," before they fled in terror, tumbling over one another in their haste. By dawn, the tale had grown into a full-fledged legend, the ghost of Edward Denholm, dictating threats to anyone who dared uncover his unfinished secrets. When Miss Marple heard the story the next day, she merely raised her brows. Children often add color to their adventures. Still, it is interesting that they all ran in the same direction. Fear is more convincing when it is shared. That afternoon, she decided to take a walk past the Grange herself. She was not one for heedless curiosity, but she had learned that mysteries often revealed themselves to the patient observer. She lingered by the gate, gazing at the ivy-clad facade. The study window was open, papers fluttering on the desk within. Carroway sat hunched, his fingers flying over the keys. The sound was steady, intense, almost frantic. As she watched, she noticed something peculiar. His lips moved, not in speech but in silence, as though he were repeating words under his breath. Yet the rumor insisted that voices were heard apart from him. Could the villagers, already primed by gossip, have mistaken his silent movements for a ghostly murmur? She was about to turn away when something caught her eye. A shadow moved behind Carroway, swift and slender, gone before she could focus. For a moment, she wondered if her eyesight, no longer quite what it had been, had deceived her. But she did not doubt her instincts. Shadows in houses often belonged to very living creatures. That evening she wrote in her notebook, "If there is whispering in the study, there must also be listening. Ghosts do not require secrecy. Humans do." The entry was underlined twice. Chapter 4. An Evening Invitation. It was not in Miss Marple's nature to push herself forward, but she had long since learned that when one sits quietly and listens, invitations come of their own accord. And so, it was no surprise to her when, one damp Thursday morning, a neatly sealed envelope was delivered to her cottage, addressed in the tight, disciplined handwriting of Mr. Lionel Carroway. Inside, on heavy cream paper, was a note. "Miss Marple, I am extending a small invitation to tea this Saturday at 4 o'clock. I understand you are one of the village's most respected residents, and I should value your acquaintance. L.C." Miss Marple read the letter twice, her pale eyes thoughtful. She knew well enough that people rarely invited her simply for social charm. More often, they wished to assess her, to measure how much she might know or suspect. Still, the opportunity was too valuable to pass by. The Grange had been the subject of more gossip than the entire parish combined, and she was about to step into its very heart. By Saturday, the village was alive with curiosity. "Do take note of everything, Jane," urged Mrs. Bantry, fairly quivering with excitement. "The furniture, the walls, the man himself. Why, even the biscuits he serves. It's bound to tell us something." "Indeed, my dear," Miss Marple replied mildly, "though one must always remember that biscuits, however stale, are rarely guilty of murder." The afternoon was grey with a fine drizzle clinging to the hedges as Miss Marple walked up the Grange drive. The house loomed above her, its gables jutting like watchful brows. She was shown in by a maid, nervous, pale, and new to the village, who hurried her through the echoing hall to the study where Carroway waited. The room was large, dominated by tall shelves sagging under books. Papers littered the great oak desk, which bore the scars of long use. And there, at its center, sat the typewriter, a monstrous black contraption that seemed to glare with a presence of its own. Its keys gleamed faintly in the lamplight, as though polished by constant use. "Miss Marple," Carroway said, rising stiffly, "I am honored. Forgive the disorder. I cannot seem to tame my work." She inclined her head, taking in every detail. The ink stains that mottled his fingers, the ragged stack of pages on one side of the machine, the torn scraps scattered like confetti on the floor. He was pale, his eyes dark-rimmed, as though sleep had abandoned him entirely. "You are kind to invite me," she said gently. "The Grange has long been a subject of interest to the village, you know." His mouth twisted into a wry smile. "Yes, I've gathered as much. Half of St. Mary Mead seems convinced I share my study with a phantom secretary." He spoke lightly, but Miss Marple caught the tension in his voice, the way his hand strayed almost protectively toward the typewriter. She let the remark pass and accepted her tea. Their conversation at first was ordinary enough, about the quiet charm of the countryside, the frustrations of unreliable servants, the unpredictable English weather. But Miss Marple was patient. She knew that people revealed themselves best when they believed they were speaking casually. "I find the nights here difficult," Carroway admitted at last, staring into his teacup. "The silence presses too heavily. I type to drive it back. Sometimes I hardly remember what I've written until I read it the next day." Miss Marple's knitting needles would have clicked at such a remark, had she brought them. Instead, she tilted her head. "How very curious. Words that arrive unbidden can sometimes be the truest of all. Or perhaps," she added softly, "they are someone else's." Carroway looked at her sharply, then gave a short laugh. "You have the village imagination, Miss Marple. But no, it is only my own weary mind." As the tea progressed, she let her gaze drift over the desk. Amid the piles of paper lay a single sheet set apart, as though placed there deliberately. The words upon it were bold, typed in uneven spacing. "She will die at the typewriter." The sentence chilled her, though her face betrayed nothing. She noted the slight tremor in Carroway's hand as he poured more tea, the way his eyes flicked toward the paper as if daring her to remark upon it. Instead, she smiled gently. "You must find inspiration a relentless companion, Mr. Carroway." "Relentless, yes," he said hoarsely. "Relentless indeed." The maid returned with a plate of biscuits, nearly dropping them in her haste. Her eyes darted toward the paper on the desk before she fled the room. Miss Marple observed the girl's fear with quiet calculation. Fear, she knew, rarely arose from nothing. When the visit ended and she stepped back into the drizzle, Miss Marple paused at the gate, her thoughts arranged with the same neatness as her teacup and saucer. In her mind, certain facts had begun to settle. Mr. Carroway was a man exhausted, yet strangely guarded, as though he carried a burden he dared not confess. The typewriter was more than a tool to him. It was a presence, both feared and defended. The servants, those closest to the study, were frightened enough to speak of whispers and omens. And most telling of all, someone had left upon that desk a threat disguised as a sentence of fiction. Back in her cottage, she opened her notebook and wrote, "Threats dressed as stories are still threats. And when a warning names a victim, the danger is not imaginary." She underlined it twice, then set down her pen. Outside, the drizzle thickened to rain, drumming softly against the window panes. In the village, gossip would continue to swirl, but Miss Marple had glimpsed enough to know that beneath the chatter lurked something far darker. The Grange was no mere haunted house. It was a stage upon which someone was preparing a performance, one that might end in blood. Chapter 5. The First Death. The storm had been grumbling over St. Mary Mead all afternoon, and by nightfall the sky broke open with furious rain. Windows rattled, branches thrashed against eaves, and the village tucked itself into silence, save for the steady downpour. But at the Grange, silence was a stranger. Inside the study, the clatter of the typewriter rattled like gunfire. It echoed through the hallways, rising and falling in uneven bursts, as though the machine were driven not by hands but by some restless, impatient spirit. The servants heard it and whispered among themselves, too frightened to linger near the door. By morning, the rain had passed, leaving the earth sodden and the air heavy with mist. At 7:30, when the maid entered the study with her usual reluctance, the tray she carried slipped from her grasp with a crash. For there, slumped across the typewriter, sat Mrs. Latimer, the housekeeper. Her head rested upon the keys, her body slack. Ink had spilled across her fingers, black stains soaking deep into her skin. But what made the girl scream was not the body itself, though that was dreadful enough. It was the sheet of paper still in the typewriter, perfectly centered, bearing the words in stark black letters. "She will die at the typewriter." Within the hour, the Grange was swarming. The vicar's wife, quick to act, fetched the doctor. Villagers gathered at the gates, their faces pale and curious, whispering in tones half thrilled, half terrified. By the time Inspector Craddock arrived from London, summoned on urgent request, the tale had already grown. The ghost had written the prophecy, the typewriter had claimed its victim, the Grange was cursed. Miss Marple, who had heard the news over breakfast at her cottage, wasted no time. She walked briskly through the damp lanes, her eyes keen and thoughtful. When she arrived at the Grange, the villagers were buzzing like flies about a honey jar. She slipped past them with a nod and was admitted by the flustered maid. The study bore the heavy scent of ink and damp wood. Mrs. Latimer's body had been removed to an adjoining room, but the typewriter still sat there, grim and defiant, the message glaring from its page. Inspector Craddock, a tall, composed man with an expression of permanent skepticism, looked up from his notebook as Miss Marple entered. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said with a faint smile. "I had wondered how long it would take before you came to inspect my crime scene." She inclined her head modestly. "When tragedy strikes so close to home, Inspector, one feels it a duty to understand." He gestured to the desk. "The facts are plain enough. Mrs. Latimer appears to have died suddenly. Likely heart failure, though the doctor will confirm. Yet she was found at the typewriter, her hands ink-stained, and this," he tapped the sheet, "this was waiting for us." Miss Marple moved closer, her eyes narrowing on the paper. A curious message. Almost as though it were written in advance. "Don't you think?" Craddock raised a brow. "You believe it was planted?" "I believe," she said softly, "that coincidence is rarely so theatrical." She examined the typewriter itself. The keys bore fresh smears of ink, far darker than the others. On the floor lay scattered torn papers, each one bearing fragments of sentences, The truth will. Beware the night. She shall. None complete, none useful. A performance, Miss Marple thought, carefully staged for an audience. Mr. Carroway entered then, pale and unshaven, his hands trembling as he pressed a handkerchief to his lips. "This is monstrous," he said hoarsely. "Mrs. Latimer, she was loyal, devoted. And now this cursed machine has taken her from us." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "You suggest the typewriter itself is guilty?" Carroway gave a strangled laugh. "What else am I to think? I never typed those words. They appear in the night. Pages vanish from my desk and return altered. You may scoff, Inspector, but the evidence sits before you." Miss Marple watched him carefully. His fear seemed genuine, but it was tinged with something more, perhaps guilt or dread of discovery. She had seen that look before, on parishioners who prayed too fervently to conceal their sins. "I wonder," she said gently, "whether Mrs. Latimer might have discovered something. Housekeepers notice more than most. If she knew who truly touched the keys at night—" She let the thought trail off. Carroway flinched, but before he could reply, the maid burst in with a sob. "I can't stay, sir, I can't. The house is haunted, I tell you. First the voices, now this. I'll not be the next one found with ink on my hands." She fled before anyone could stop her, leaving silence in her wake. Craddock sighed. Superstition breeds faster than facts in these villages. Still, there's something damned peculiar here. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room once more. She noticed the ink bottle, toppled slightly, as though knocked in haste. A handkerchief, crumpled near the desk, bearing not the fine initials of Carroway but the plain stitching of servant's linen. And on the carpet, half hidden beneath the desk, the faint outline of a muddy footprint. Too small for Carroway, too broad for Mrs. Latimer. "Facts are present, Inspector," she murmured. "One only needs the patience to see them." That evening, as the body was borne away and the villagers whispered by lamplight, Miss Marple sat in her cottage with her notebook. She wrote down her observations in neat lines. Message typed in advance of death. Ink stains on victim's hands unnatural. Likely placed post-mortem. Torn scraps deliberately scattered. Extra footprint beneath desk. Servant's handkerchief left behind. She tapped her pen thoughtfully. To the villagers, the ghostly typewriter had claimed its first victim. But to Miss Marple, the matter was far simpler and far darker. Someone had killed Mrs. Latimer, not with phantoms, but with calculation. The question was not whether the typewriter was haunted, but who was using superstition as their clever disguise. And if the warning upon the page was to be believed, Mrs. Latimer would not be the last. Chapter 6: Scotland Yard Arrives. Inspector Craddock had been many places in his career. Dingy backstreets of London, country estates filled with scandal, even the occasional foreign posting where everything smelled of spice and dust. Yet there was something uniquely troublesome about St. Mary Mead. It looked far too peaceful. Whenever such villages dressed themselves in roses and lace curtains, he suspected mischief hid beneath. And Miss Marple, sitting primly in her corner with her gentle knitting, only confirmed his suspicion. She had a way of knowing things before he did, which unsettled him more than he would ever confess. By the time he returned to the Grange the morning after Mrs. Latimer's death, Scotland Yard had already dispatched 2 men from London to assist. One was Sergeant Willis, reliable and methodical. The other a young constable named Hughes, keen to prove himself. The trio convened in the drawing-room, where the heavy curtains kept out the wan morning light, and the air smelled faintly of polish and damp wood. Carroway greeted them with haggard courtesy. His face was sallow, his eyes red-rimmed from sleeplessness. "You may search where you please," he said with weary resignation. "I've nothing to hide, though I doubt you'll find sense in this madness." "Madness?" Craddock asked, fixing him with a sharp look. Carroway gestured toward the study. "The typewriter, Inspector. It writes when no one touches it. Pages alter themselves. And now Mrs. Latimer is dead." He lowered his voice, glancing toward the hall as if the very walls might overhear. "Do you mean to tell me a machine cannot kill?" Craddock's mouth twitched. "Machines don't kill, Mr. Carroway. People do. My task is to discover which person it was." Miss Marple, who had been allowed to sit quietly in the corner, ostensibly as a neighbor and nothing more, lifted her pale eyes from her knitting. "It is rather important to remember," she said softly, "that one needn't touch the keys of a typewriter to make use of it. One may simply choose the right moment to leave a message upon it." Hughes frowned. "You mean someone typed that line beforehand? Just waited for it to be discovered?" "Exactly, my dear boy," Miss Marple replied, her needles clicking gently. "Superstition thrives best when it is carefully fed." Carraway stiffened as though the words stung him. He muttered something about imagination and withdrew to the window, staring out at the mist that clung to the lawns. Craddock ordered the study examined thoroughly. Sergeant Willis bent to the carpet with a magnifying glass, tracing the faint outline Miss Marple had noticed the day before. "2 sets of prints here," Willis reported. "One small, one larger. Neither matches the housekeeper's shoes." "And this handkerchief," Hughes added, holding up the plain square of linen Miss Marple had already marked in her mind. "No initials. Servant's issue, perhaps. Found crumpled by the desk." Carraway paled. Latimer kept a drawer of such things in the pantry. Any of the staff might have taken one. Craddock glanced at Miss Marple. "You see how superstition clouds judgment? A handkerchief is evidence, not a phantom." Miss Marple gave a mild smile. "Yes, Inspector. But sometimes evidence, like superstition, is planted where it will be noticed." The search continued. They found scraps of manuscript in the wastebasket, each bearing half-formed threats. "The end comes at night. Blood will mark the keys. She shall pay." Too theatrical, too deliberate. Craddock scowled at them, muttering about amateur dramatics. Meanwhile, the villagers had grown restless. Outside the gates of the Grange, a crowd gathered daily, exchanging tales. The story had already expanded beyond recognition. The ghost of the failed novelist still roamed the halls. Mrs. Latimer had been found with her eyes wide open, screaming even in death. The typewriter had rattled of its own accord at midnight. Miss Marple heard it all at the grocer's, the post office, even whispered in the pews of the church. She listened politely, never contradicting, but her mind worked quietly, piecing truth from invention. On the 3rd day, Craddock summoned all the servants into the dining hall. They came nervously. The trembling maid, the taciturn gardener, the cook with her flushed cheeks, and the footman recently employed from a neighboring parish. Craddock questioned each in turn, pressing about movements on the night of the death. The maid, eyes darting, swore she had heard typing even after she had gone to bed, though she could not say who was in the study. The gardener claimed he had seen a lantern flicker by the churchyard around midnight, but thought no more of it. The cook had nothing to offer but tales of cold draughts and strange dreams. And the footman, an insolent young man with 2 shiny boots, declared boldly that he knew nothing, though his evasive glance told another story. Afterwards, as the staff dispersed, Miss Marple leaned toward Craddock. "That young man," she said mildly, "has the look of one who fears discovery more than ghosts." Craddock grunted. "I'll keep him in mind." That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, reflecting. She had seen small things others missed, the tremor in Carraway's hand, the maid's terror, the footman's restless eyes. She considered how fear could be used as a cloak, how superstition might mask deliberate cruelty. In her notebook she wrote, "Supernatural tale serves as disguise. Too many scraps of prophecy. Staged, not genuine. Housekeeper likely knew truth, silenced before she could speak. Someone clever enough to use typewriter as weapon of fear." She closed the book with a sigh. Scotland Yard had arrived, yes, but the answers lay not in the weight of evidence alone. They lay in the frailty of human nature, the envy, the greed, the desperation that drove people to cloak themselves in shadows. And in that frailty, Miss Marple knew, someone in St. Mary Mead was hiding a murder. Chapter 7. Ghostly Messages. The Grange seemed unable to rest. Even after Mrs. Latimer's body was carried out, even after the police sealed the study for careful examination, whispers still traveled its dark hallways. The servants crept about as though every door concealed a phantom, and Mr. Carraway grew more hollow-eyed with each passing day. But what disturbed the village most were the new messages. It began 2 nights after Scotland Yard's arrival. Sergeant Willis had locked the study door himself, pocketed the key, and stationed a constable outside. No one entered, no one touched the machine. Yet in the morning, a fresh sheet of paper sat waiting in the typewriter. The words were stark and chilling. "Another will fall." The constable swore he had seen no one, heard no sound beyond the rustle of rain. The key remained in Willis's pocket. Yet the message was there, undeniable. By breakfast, the tale had already escaped the Grange. At the bakery, at the butcher's, in the vicarage, people repeated it with wide eyes. Some said the ghost of the novelist had returned, furious that his words had been forgotten. Others whispered that Mrs. Latimer herself now haunted the quays, warning of vengeance. Fear swelled like a tide, and the village could speak of little else. Inspector Craddock, however, was unmoved. He stood in the study with his hands behind his back, glaring at the typewriter as though sheer suspicion might make it confess. "Someone is playing a trick," he declared. "The question is how." Miss Marple, who had been allowed to observe, glanced at the paper without touching it. "A trick, yes. But one played with confidence. Whoever does this knows not only how to slip past your constable, but also how to stoke the imagination of an entire village." Caraway, pale and shaking, pressed his fists against his temples. "Don't you see? It's beyond explanation. The machine writes of its own accord. I am cursed, Inspector. And soon, perhaps, I shall be the one who falls." Craddock scowled. "If you persist in such talk, sir, you'll only encourage hysteria. Machines do not kill. People do." Yet even he could not wholly explain how the sheet had appeared. He ordered every lock tested, every window examined, and every servant questioned again. Still nothing. The second message came the following night. Again the door was locked. Again a constable stood watch. Yet in the morning another sheet waited. The keys shall strike again. By now panic had spread. Villagers avoided walking past the Grange after dusk. The maid gave notice and fled to her cousin's farm. The cook muttered about spirits and packed her bags. Even the gardener spoke of leaving. Only the footman remained, smirking with bravado, though his eyes betrayed unease. Miss Marple, meanwhile, remained calm. She visited the Grange in daylight, her steps quiet, her eyes attentive. In the study she noted the smallest details, the way the curtains fell just so, the faint scratch marks near the lock, the dust disturbed at the windowsill. She asked gently about the typewriter's history. Caraway explained it had belonged to the former owner of the Grange, a minor novelist who had died penniless, his manuscripts unpublished. "They say he typed until his last breath," Caraway murmured, pleading with the world to remember him. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "The world does not often remember what is not worth remembering. But the living, Mr. Caraway, they may have stronger motives than the dead." That evening she sat by her fire, notebook open, and listed her thoughts. Locked room suggests inside knowledge. Messages appear too brief, too dramatic, like headlines, not genuine writing. Servants unsettled. Those who remain may profit from fear. Rivalry, ambition, desperation. These drive living hands more than any ghost. The third message was the most dreadful yet. It appeared on a stormy night when wind howled through the chimneys and lightning tore jagged paths across the sky. In the morning, the constable opened the study to find the typewriter waiting, grim and silent, with its latest prophecy. "Blood will mark the keys." The paper was flecked with tiny drops of red. Not ink, but something far darker. The village reeled. Women clutched their children, men muttered about curses, and the church bell tolled with mournful weight. Rumors now insisted that the ghost demanded sacrifice. "2 deaths will not suffice," whispered Mrs. Bantry over her teacup, eyes wide. "It will take another before it rests." Inspector Craddock, though skeptical, was shaken. He had watched over the house himself that night, making rounds every hour. How, then, had the message been planted? Miss Marple, however, remained composed. She bent over the sheet, her sharp eyes studying the red flecks. "Not blood, Inspector," she said softly. "Not human blood, at least. Chicken liver, I should think, pressed against the paper to mimic the effect. A butcher's trick no more. Craddock exhaled slowly. So someone enters despite the locks. But how? Perhaps, she said gently, because they do not need to enter at all. There are often old ways in old houses. Panels, passages, forgotten keys. And of course, there is always the possibility of collusion. Her gaze lingered on the footman who stood at the door, arms folded. He smirked when their eyes met, but shifted uneasily, as though her gaze had peeled back some layer of his bravado. That night, as thunder rolled again across the fields, Miss Marple wrote a single line in her notebook. Ghosts do not leave footprints. Men do. Chapter 8 Old Secrets of the Grange. The rain had cleared, leaving behind a pale morning sun that slanted through the mist. In St. Mary Mead, the garden sparkled with droplets, and children splashed in puddles. Yet for all its brightness, a pall lingered over the village. The Grange had become a place of dread, and the talk at the grocer's was no longer of jam recipes or seed catalogues, but of prophecies, death, and curses. Miss Marple, seated in her neat little sitting room, listened to it all with a patient half-smile. She had learned long ago that gossip was like smoke, ephemeral, drifting, but always pointing back to the fire from which it came. And so, after a morning spent among neighbors, she returned to her cottage with a mind full of hints and shadows. She laid aside her knitting and opened her notebook. At the top she wrote in her fine, spidery hand, "The past of the Grange," for she knew that houses, like people, carry their histories with them, and secrets seldom die quietly. That afternoon, she walked to the vicarage. Reverend Leonard Clement, kindly and earnest, welcomed her warmly. "You've come about the Grange, Miss Marple? I thought you might. Half the village seems convinced it's haunted." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Yes, my dear Leonard. But haunting is rarely the work of ghosts. More often, it is the echo of some human folly." The vicar led her to his study, where he kept parish records, old maps, and volumes of local history. "You'll find what you want here," he said, leaving her among the dust and parchment. Miss Marple worked quietly, her eyes scanning pages with surprising speed for one of her age. She traced the history of the Grange. Built in the late 18th century by a prosperous merchant, passed through several families, and eventually purchased by one Edgar Ray, a novelist of modest talent and considerable pride. Ray had moved to the Grange some 30 years earlier, filled with ambition. He wrote furiously, but none of his manuscripts found a publisher. His finances dwindled, his wife left him, and at last he died alone, found at his desk with his unfinished novel beside him. The villagers whispered that he had cursed the house with his dying breath. Miss Marple paused, fingers resting lightly on the faded ink. A novelist, obsessed with his typewriter, scorned by publishers, dead in despair. It was not difficult to see how a story of haunting had grown from such fertile soil. She copied names and dates into her notebook. Edgar Ray, 1872 to 1923. Titles of unpublished works. The Bleakest Hour, The Keys of Fate, The Last Sentence. Dramatic titles, suited to a man who fancied himself tragic. But what caught her attention most was a small entry in the parish register. Ray, Edgar, interred St. Mary Mead churchyard. Stone erected by unknown benefactor. Unknown benefactor. That, she thought, was a thread worth tugging. Later, over tea with Mrs. Bantry, she probed further. "You recall Edgar Ray, I think?" she asked lightly. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Bantry said eagerly. "A frightful bore, always muttering about genius unrecognized. My late husband said he was forever pestering London publishers. And when he died, well, some say he still prowls the Grange, pounding his ghostly keys." She shivered theatrically. "Did he leave family?" Miss Marple asked. "None that I know of, though there was some talk of a nephew, or perhaps a cousin, who quarreled with him over money. It all ended badly." Miss Marple nodded, storing the tidbit away. Quarrels over money rarely ended without bitterness, and bitterness often lingered longer than bloodlines. That evening, she walked to the churchyard. The stones stood gray and crooked in the fading light, names half-worn by weather. At last she found it. Edgar Ray, novelist, 1872 to 1923. Words shall outlive the man. The epitaph was oddly grand for a man of no success. Miss Marple bent closer, brushing moss from the carved letters. At the base, she noticed something unusual. Fresh flowers, not wilted but newly placed. Someone still remembered Edgar Ray. Someone still visited his grave. Her eyes lingered on the blooms. Simple wildflowers, tied with plain string. Not the gesture of a villager who would have brought garden roses, nor of the church which supplied nothing so regular. No, this was the act of a single person quietly faithful. As she straightened, she caught sight of movement beyond the yew hedge. A figure slipping away toward the lane. Tall, broad-shouldered, coat collar upturned. She glimpsed the glint of polished boots. The footman from the Grange. Miss Marple's lips pressed together in thought. So the insolent young man had some connection to Edgar Ray. That explained his unease, his defiance under Craddock's questioning. And perhaps, she thought, it explained why the typewriter's drama seemed staged with such conviction. She returned home with her mind buzzing. That night, by lamplight, she wrote in her notebook. Edgar Ray, failed novelist, obsession with typewriter. Died at desk. Seed of haunting legend. Grave tended by unknown hand. Possibly footman. Motive may lie in inheritance, pride, or unfinished manuscript. Present haunting. Performance inspired by past tragedy. She closed the book, folded her hands, and stared into the fire. The Grange was not haunted by spirits, she was certain. It was haunted by the ambitions of the living. Ambitions that reached back through decades of disappointment and resentment. And somewhere in those ambitions lay the reason Mrs. Latimer was dead. Chapter 9. The Vanishing Pages. The morning after her quiet discovery in the churchyard, Miss Marple rose early. The village was still wrapped in mist, the hedges glistening with dew. She moved about her cottage with her usual economy of motion. Teapot warmed, toast buttered, the cat fed, all while her mind spun threads together like a patient weaver at her loom. One thread, in particular, tugged at her thoughts. Edgar Ray, the failed novelist. A man obsessed with words. Dead in disappointment. And yet, even in death, he seemed to linger. His grave was tended. His typewriter clicked in the Grange at night. And his story was not yet finished. By 10 o'clock, she had decided. She wrapped her shawl firmly around her shoulders and made her way toward the Grange. Inspector Craddock, summoned by Mrs. Bantry's insistence the day before, had promised to meet her there. He was already waiting at the gates, notebook in hand, looking harassed by the villagers who had gathered to watch. "Morning, Miss Marple," he greeted, with the resigned air of a man who knew he was about to be led down paths far stranger than police training ever covered. "You're determined to nose about this business, aren't you?" "My dear Inspector," she said sweetly, "if one has lived in a village as long as I have, one becomes quite adept at distinguishing real hauntings from false ones. And this," she waved a hand toward the looming house, "smells of powder, not phantoms." Inside, the Grange was dim, its curtains still drawn against the pale sun. The drawing room smelled faintly of dust and old ink. The typewriter sat on its desk, silent now, keys dark with use. Craddock frowned at it. "We've checked it half a dozen times. Nothing odd. No tricks of string or spring I can find. And yet, night after night, the thing starts up." Miss Marple moved closer, peering at the machine with interest. "Might I?" she asked, and at his nod she lowered herself into the chair. Her thin fingers hovered above the keys, then pressed one delicately. It struck with a satisfying snap, leaving an impression on the paper still rolled into the carriage. But when she read the impression, her brows lifted. The paper was covered with half-typed words, broken sentences, lines abandoned mid-phrase, as though someone had begun writing furiously, only to stop in sudden haste. "What's this?" she murmured. "Pages left last night," Craddock said grimly. "We collected them. But the odd thing is, there should have been 3. Now there are only 2. The third's gone missing." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Vanishing pages," she said softly. "That is rather telling, is it not?" Together, they examined the surviving sheets. The text was jumbled, erratic, but the words themselves chilled. "The woman knows too much. She must be silenced. Justice lies beneath the floorboards." Craddock shifted uncomfortably. If it's meant as a threat, it worked. Half the village thinks the ghost's writing its confessions. Miss Marple tapped the desk with one gloved finger. And yet ghosts rarely trouble themselves with paper. No, Inspector, this is the hand of someone very much alive. At that moment, the door creaked open. The footman, the tall young man Miss Marple had glimpsed at the grave, entered with a tray of tea. His expression was studiously blank, but his eyes flickered toward the typewriter before he set the tray down. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost grandmotherly. "Do you write, young man?" He froze. "No, ma'am." "Strange," she said mildly. "For your boots were very muddy when you left the churchyard last night. One does not often soil one's boots so at that hour, unless one is visiting a grave." The cup rattled slightly as he set it down. "I don't know what you mean." But she saw the muscle tighten in his jaw, the faint tremor of guilt. He excused himself quickly, leaving the room with too much haste. Craddock stared after him. "Well, I'll be. How on earth did you know?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. Young men are rarely careful about where they tread. Mud tells its own tale, if one knows how to read it. And he is clearly connected to Edgar Ray. The tending of the grave, the glances toward this typewriter. It is not affection alone. It is obsession. Craddock rubbed his chin. Then perhaps he's our ghost? Typing threats in the night to frighten the villagers. Perhaps, Miss Marple murmured. But there is more. Where is the missing page, Inspector? That page will tell us who truly drives this charade. The search began. They questioned the housemaid, the cook, even Mrs. Latimer's niece who had been staying nearby. All denied knowledge of the page. But in the kitchen wastebasket, beneath peelings and scraps, Craddock found a crumpled sheet. Smoothing it out, they read the words. "She discovered the will. She cannot be allowed to speak. The fortune must remain mine." Craddock's eyes widened. That's not a ghost. That's motive. Miss Marple's expression grew grave. "Indeed. Mrs. Latimer's death is no accident, Inspector. She stumbled upon a secret. A will, perhaps, hidden here in the Grange. And for that she was silenced." Craddock swore softly. Then whoever's behind this used the legend of the ghostly typewriter as cover, to make the crime seem supernatural. "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "But criminals, like bad writers, leave traces of their plot. And this one has already betrayed himself in ink." She tapped the salvaged page. "The question now, Inspector, is whose fortune is at stake? Edgar Ray's? Or another's entirely? We must look not only at the house, but at the papers long buried in it. Somewhere here lies a will, and in that will lies the name of our killer." Her eyes, sharp and bright despite her years, swept the dim drawing room. "And I fancy the walls of this old house are eager to give up their secrets, if we but press them in the right places." The fire crackled. The typewriter stood silent, its keys gleaming like teeth. And in the hush of the Grange, the air seemed thick with stories yet untold. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "Let us begin, Inspector. The house itself will speak, if we listen carefully." Chapter 10: Shadows in the Attic. The Grange, like most houses of its age, had a way of guarding its secrets in the uppermost places, where dust gathered and silence lingered. The attic stretched low and sprawling beneath the sloped roof, a warren of beams, cobwebs, and forgotten trunks. Few of the servants went there except to fetch moth-eaten linens or old holiday decorations. And so, when Miss Marple suggested the search should begin above rather than below, Inspector Craddock looked doubtful. "The attic," he repeated, squinting up the narrow staircase. "I'd have thought the study or library more promising for hidden wills." Miss Marple's voice was mild. "Oh, quite. But wills and papers are often concealed in places where prying relatives are least likely to look. Attics, Inspector, are very much like old ladies' sewing baskets, filled with scraps, bits, and things that one cannot bear to throw away. And sometimes, amidst the scraps, one finds the thread that holds the whole fabric together." Reluctantly, Craddock led the way, lantern in hand. The wooden steps groaned underfoot as they ascended, the air growing cooler, tinged with the scent of old fabric and wood rot. A servant girl trailed nervously behind them, muttering about things moving in the rafters. The attic was a vast, dim space, beams crossing overhead like the ribs of a great beast. Trunks lay in haphazard rows, their lids warped with age. A broken rocking chair sat in one corner, its shadow stretching long in the lantern light. Dust danced in the beams as Miss Marple stepped carefully forward, her eyes sharper than Craddock's despite her age. They began the slow work of searching. One trunk contained old clothes yellowed with time. Another held bundles of letters tied with ribbon, their ink faded but still legible. Miss Marple sorted through them quickly. Most were trivial. Correspondence between Edgar Ray and hopeful publishers, letters of rejection growing ever more curt as the years passed. But then she paused at one envelope, tucked deep at the bottom. "This is curious," she murmured, handing it to Craddock. The letter, dated just months before Ray's death, was written in an agitated scrawl. "If they learn the truth, the fortune will be lost. I cannot allow it. Better the words stay hidden forever, sealed away until I return." Craddock frowned. That sounds like he was hiding something. A will, perhaps. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Or pages that proved inconvenient to someone else. Writers, Inspector, are rather careless with words, but not with secrets. Before they could say more, the servant girl gave a small cry. "Look over there." They turned toward the far end of the attic. Against the wall, half hidden beneath a dust sheet, stood an object unmistakable in its shape, another typewriter. Craddock strode forward, pulling away the cloth. "Good Lord! There are two of them." The machine was older, rusted at the edges, but still serviceable. Beside it lay a small wooden box locked. Craddock tried the latch, but it held fast. Miss Marple bent closer, noting the initials carved faintly on the lid. E.W. "Edgar Ray's," she said softly. They carried the box down to the study, where Craddock pried it open with a paper knife. Inside lay a stack of papers. Manuscript pages, neatly typed but never bound. The title read, "The Last Sentence by Edgar Ray." Craddock skimmed the first few lines aloud. "A tale of betrayal, inheritance, and the treachery of kin." He looked up sharply. "It's practically describing our case." Miss Marple nodded. "Art imitates life, Inspector. And sometimes life imitates art. I wonder which came first for poor Mr. Ray." But as they examined the pages more closely, they noticed something unsettling. Several had been torn away, leaving only jagged edges. Whole chapters vanished. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Again, vanishing pages. Someone does not wish the full story to be known. That night, the mystery deepened. The household had retired when the sound began again, the clacking of typewriter keys, steady and insistent, drifting down from the attic above. The servants huddled in fear. "It's the ghost," one whispered. "He's angry we've disturbed his things." Craddock muttered a curse, grabbing his lantern. "If it's a ghost, I'll arrest him all the same." But when he and Miss Marple ascended, the attic was empty. The typewriter sat motionless, yet a new sheet of paper had been rolled into it. In stark black ink, the words read, "The attic holds more than dust. Look beneath the beams, where shadows stretch longest." The servant girl fled, sobbing. Craddock looked ready to follow. But Miss Marple, calm as ever, studied the paper with sharp eyes. "This is no phantom, Inspector. Someone is using the legend most cleverly. They knew we would come searching, and they guide us further still." She lifted the lantern, sweeping its glow across the beams overhead. The shadows stretched deep into one corner, where the wood dipped low. And there, half hidden by insulation and dust, was a loose plank. Craddock climbed up, prying it open. From the cavity within he pulled a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a sheaf of legal papers, their seals broken but still intact enough to read. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. "Ah, just as I thought. The missing will." The document was clear. Edgar Ray had left what remained of his fortune not to distant relations, but to the faithful servant of my house, who alone remembered me in my decline. Craddock let out a low whistle. "The servant? Then our footman, he's heir to it all." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Indeed. And perhaps that explains his devotion to the grave, and his unease at our questions. Yet it also explains something more dreadful: why Mrs. Latimer had to die. For if she found this will, and realized the inheritance was not hers, she might have spoken. Craddock swore under his breath. So the haunting, the typewriter, all of it, it's been smoke and mirrors to cover up murder and fraud. Precisely, Miss Marple said gently. But smoke always clears, Inspector. And shadows cannot hide forever. The lantern flickered, throwing long beams across the attic. Beneath those shadows lay the truth of the Grange. Greed, silence, and the weight of old secrets, now uncovered at last. And yet Miss Marple, peering into the darkness, knew this was not the end. For someone still moved in those shadows. Someone who had torn pages, who had typed false words, who had killed to keep a fortune. The question was not who had inherited. The question was who had killed to keep it so. Chapter 11. The Ink-Stained Alibi. The discovery of Edgar Ray's will send ripples through St. Mary Mead like stones cast upon still water. The notion that a servant could inherit the Grange unsettled everyone. In the tea-shops, voices buzzed with speculation. Some pitied the young footman, others suspected him outright. A few, more superstitious, whispered that Edgar Ray's ghost had chosen his heir and would not rest until the fortune was rightly claimed. Miss Marple, however, was not swayed by gossip. She knew too well that inheritance brought with it not only money but motive, and that motive had a way of bleeding into murder. Inspector Craddock, harried and weary, called a meeting in the Grange study. The suspects gathered, the footman pale but defiant, the housemaid wringing her hands, Mrs. Latimer's niece, her eyes sharp with watchful calculation, and the cook stout and indignant at the very idea she could be mixed up in crime. The typewriter sat silent, a mute witness to their assembly. Its keys gleamed in the lamplight, waiting. Craddock cleared his throat. Now then, we've found a will naming this young man, he nodded toward the footman, as heir to the Grange. But we've also found evidence of tampered papers and, worse, murder. Someone killed Mrs. Latimer because she stumbled upon this secret. I mean to know who. The room tensed. The footman shifted uneasily. I never touched her, he burst out. I looked after Mr. Ray's grave, true enough. I even read his manuscripts sometimes. But murder? No, sir. I'd no reason. Inheritance or no, I didn't even know the will was there until you pulled it out. Craddock eyed him sternly. Convenient. And yet you were seen near the churchyard. And you've been unusually defensive. The footman's jaw tightened. Because I knew you'd point at me the moment you found the will. But I've an alibi. A hush fell. I was in the kitchen that night, he said firmly. The cook saw me. Ask her. All eyes turned. The cook frowned, wiping her hands on her apron. It's true enough he came down for tea around midnight. Sat with me near half an hour. But I can't swear he stayed after. I went off to bed. Craddock scribbled in his notebook, muttering darkly. So part of an alibi, not the whole. It was then Miss Marple spoke, her tone deceptively gentle. Perhaps we should consider something smaller, yet far more telling. She produced a handkerchief from her knitting bag. Upon it was a faint smear of ink, dark against the white linen. I found this in the scullery basin this morning, she explained. It belongs, I believe, to our footman. The initials are stitched in the corner. Now, Inspector, does it not strike you as curious that a servant, who claims no interest in writing, should have such fresh ink upon his hands? The footman's face flushed. I sometimes copied out passages from Mr. Ray's old pages. To practice my letters. Practice. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Or to forge. For these ghostly messages that appear at the typewriter require someone not only bold enough to play tricks but skilled enough to imitate Edgar Ray's furious style. A forgery, my dear Inspector, can be as telling as a confession. The niece interjected quickly. But if he forged the messages, then he's the guilty one. Surely that proves it. Miss Marple's smile was faint. Oh, not at all. Forgery proves involvement, not guilt. A forger may serve another master. One must ask, Why risk typing such incriminating words unless under pressure? The footman's lips trembled. I was told. He stopped short. Miss Marple leaned forward. Yes, dear boy. Told by whom? But he would say no more, only shaking his head violently. Craddock slammed the table. Enough dodging. If you're covering for someone, you'll hang with them. Miss Marple, however, remained calm. She adjusted her spectacles, her eyes resting on Mrs. Latimer's niece. The young woman's expression was cool, almost amused. Too cool, Miss Marple thought, for someone who had lost her aunt so suddenly. Perhaps, Miss Marple murmured, we should turn our attention to the missing pages once more. For ink does not vanish by chance. Someone took those chapters from Ray's manuscript because they revealed too much. And who, I wonder, was quick to point the finger at the footman? The niece met her gaze evenly. You think me capable of murder, Miss Marple? My aunt was my dearest companion. I came here only to comfort her. Indeed. Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her eyes were sharp. And yet you stand to gain nothing from her death, unless she had already discovered something that imperiled your claim. A will, for instance, naming another heir. The niece's mask faltered, if only for a heartbeat. Craddock seized on it. So it's money after all. Miss Marple raised a hand delicately. Patience, Inspector. We must not leap to conclusions. Ink-stained alibis are very much like knitting drop stitches. They appear small, but they unravel a whole pattern. This young man's alibi tells us he was here, yes, but the ink tells us he was made to write, not to think, which means the true author of this drama still sits among us. The typewriter loomed in the silence, a silent conspirator. Miss Marple folded her hands serenely. The truth, Inspector, lies not only in who touched the machine, but in who directed its performance. And I believe we are very close indeed to unmasking the hand that guides it all. Craddock exhaled slowly. Then tomorrow we press harder. Someone here has blood on their hands. And if it isn't the servant boy. He glanced meaningfully at the niece. Then perhaps another shadow is moving behind the scenes. Miss Marple said nothing, only returned the ink-stained handkerchief to her bag. She knew the play was not yet over. The ghostly typewriter would speak again, and when it did, it would point, perhaps unwillingly, to the murderer's name. Chapter 12. The Midnight Confession. The Grange was restless that night. The servants whispered in corners, refusing to go upstairs alone. Lamps were left burning in the hallways, and every creak of the old beams seemed magnified into something sinister. Even Inspector Craddock, who had scoffed at superstition, kept his revolver closer than usual. Miss Marple, however, sat calmly in the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking steadily. She knew fear when she saw it, and she also knew fear had a way of fleshing out truth. A guilty conscience rarely slept soundly in a haunted house. By 11, the house had grown still. The servants retired. Craddock dozed uneasily in a chair, and the great-grandfather clock ticked ponderously in the hall. Then, just as midnight struck, the sound came again, the sharp, insistent clatter of typewriter keys. Craddock jerked awake, swearing under his breath. There it is again. This time we catch them. But Miss Marple lifted a hand. Patience, Inspector. Let the play unfold. The guilty will reveal themselves if we do not startle them too soon. They listened. The typing grew faster, urgent, almost frantic. Then it stopped abruptly. Silence followed. A silence heavy enough to make the air itself seem to hold its breath. Miss Marple rose quietly. Now, she whispered. Together, they climbed the stairs to the study. The typewriter sat upon its desk. A new page rolled into place. Written in harsh, uneven strokes were the words. She found the will. She threatened to tell. I had no choice. Forgive me, Edgar. Craddock's eyes widened. A confession. Signed by no hand, yet damning all the same. But Miss Marple frowned. Not quite, Inspector. Confessions typed in anonymity are often the work of manipulation. Note the words, "Forgive me, Edgar." That is meant to cast suspicion on one who tended his grave. At that very moment, a figure stepped into the doorway, pale and trembling. It was the footman. His eyes darted to the page, then to Craddock's revolver. "It was me," he blurted. "I did it. I killed Mrs. Latimer. I couldn't let her ruin everything." Craddock started forward. "So you admit it." But Miss Marple's sharp voice cut through. "Stop." All eyes turned to her. She set her knitting calmly aside. "That, Inspector, is no confession. It is a performance. The boy is reciting lines given to him, not truth. Look at his hands. Trembling, yes, but not with guilt. With fear." The footman shook his head wildly. "You don't understand. I was told to," he broke off, choking on his words. Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice softening. "My dear, who told you? Who promised you protection if only you said these words? Who threatened you if you did not?" The boy's lips trembled. His gaze flicked almost involuntarily toward Mrs. Latimer's niece, who stood rigid at the far end of the room. Miss Marple saw it, as did Craddock. "Ah," Miss Marple said gently. "The shadow behind the curtain. The prompter, not the actor. You see, Inspector, criminals often rely on others to carry their burden, but the weakest link always frays first. This boy was no murderer, only a frightened pawn in another's game." Craddock advanced on the niece, his jaw set. "Well, miss, what do you have to say for yourself?" Her face remained composed, but her eyes glittered with defiance. "Say, only that you are all bewitched by an old woman's tales." The footman admitted it. "You heard him. Why look further?" "Because," Miss Marple replied softly, "admissions born of fear are worth less than silence. And because the true murderer is not content to remain hidden. They crave control, control of the narrative, control of the fortune, control even of the ghostly typewriter. But such craving betrays them in the end." The niece's lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple turned once more to the footman. "My dear, you said you were told to confess. Was it by promise of money?" The boy swallowed hard. "Yes. She said if I took the blame, she'd see me right. Said no jury would hang me with my age and good service. Said I'd be out in a few years with enough money to start anew." A murmur of shock rippled through the room. Craddock's fist slammed the desk. "So that's the game. She killed her aunt, planted messages, and tried to frame the servant boy." The niece's composure cracked. "You fools! Do you think I'd let a fortune slip to a servant? Edgar Ray was a madman. That will should have been mine by rights. Aunt Latimer found it, and I silenced her before she could ruin everything." Her voice rose, shrill, the mask torn away. "The ghostly typewriter was my stage. My drama. I wrote the lines, I set the keys clattering. I wove the legend into a snare, and you all walked straight into it." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling like dust. Then Craddock moved swiftly, snapping handcuffs onto her wrists. "You'll have plenty of time to write in Holloway jail," he said grimly. Miss Marple, unruffled, retrieved her knitting once more. "Theater is all very well for village fetes," she murmured. "But in murder, theatrics are a poor disguise. Truth, like ink, seeps through the paper eventually." As the niece was led away, the footman sagged with relief, tears streaking his face. Miss Marple patted his arm kindly. "You were foolish, my dear, but not wicked. Remember this, those who write your part for you rarely mean you well." The typewriter sat silent once more, its final act played. The midnight confession had unmasked the hand that guided the keys, and the ghost of Edgar Ray, at last, could rest in peace. Chapter 13. The Silent Grave. The night after the niece's arrest, St. Mary Mead seemed quieter, though not entirely at peace. The Grange had yielded its secrets in a sudden violent unraveling, yet Miss Marple knew that beneath the surface, truth often left splinters behind. A confession shouted in rage was convincing to many, but to Jane Marple it had sounded almost too theatrical, as though the niece had stepped into a role that had long been rehearsed. By dawn, Inspector Craddock had departed to London with his prisoner, the young footman had been sent to relatives for his own safety, and the servants at the Grange whispered about how quickly shadows turned traitor. Miss Marple, however, rose at her usual hour, dressed in her neat grey suit, and walked to the churchyard. The air was cool, heavy with the dew of early morning. Birds stirred reluctantly in the hedgerows, and the church bell tolled the half-hour. Miss Marple moved slowly among the gravestones, pausing now and again to read inscriptions faded by weather and time. She had always believed one could learn much from the dead, not by their silence, but by the traces they left behind. At last she came to the corner where Edgar Ray was buried. His grave was an unassuming plot, marked by a headstone of modest stonework. Ivy curled at its base. Yet Miss Marple noticed immediately that the soil was not as it should be. It had been disturbed, recently. She knelt, touching the earth lightly with her gloved fingers. The ground was loose, not hardened by months of settling. Someone had been here within the last week. Perhaps even within the last few days. "Miss Marple," came a voice behind her. She turned to find Reverend Pritchard, the vicar, watching her with mild surprise. "Out so early?" he asked. "I thought only the crows kept vigil at this hour." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A habit of age, I'm afraid. One wakes before the sun quite on its own. But tell me, Reverend, has Edgar Ray's grave been tended of late?" The vicar frowned. "Not to my knowledge. The niece, well, she seldom came here. Mrs. Latimer sometimes placed flowers, but she's gone now. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple pointed delicately. "Because someone has disturbed it. And not to lay flowers, I think. The earth speaks when one listens. This grave has been opened, perhaps not fully but prized at as though something were hidden beneath." The vicar's face paled. "Surely not. Why, it's desecration." "Desecration," Miss Marple said softly. "Or concealment." They stood in silence, the weight of possibility pressing upon them. By afternoon, Inspector Craddock had been summoned back in haste. He arrived irritable and weary, for London had been swift to doubt the niece's dramatic confession. She had already retracted half her words, claiming coercion and hysteria. Miss Marple guided him directly to the churchyard. Together with the vicar and a gravedigger, they set to work with careful spades. The soil gave way easily, confirming her suspicion. Within an hour, the grave yielded not bones, but a small rusted iron box wrapped in oilcloth. Craddock pried it open. Inside were papers, yellowed but still legible. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and leaned close. "A will," she murmured. "The true will of Edgar Ray. See here, dated 6 months after the one the niece contested. And look, you will observe it leaves everything not to his niece, not to Mrs. Latimer, but to a charity. The London Home for Orphan Children." Craddock swore under his breath. So neither of them had any right to the fortune. Miss Marple nodded gravely. "Which explains much, does it not? The niece's desperation. Mrs. Latimer's secret knowledge. But it also suggests a greater cunning at work. Someone knew this will was hidden here, and someone sought to retrieve or suppress it." The vicar wrung his hands. But who would know such a thing? Surely not the servants. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the disturbed soil. The one who disturbed the grave may yet reveal themselves. Guilt, like ivy, has a way of creeping into daylight. That night, Craddock placed guards around the churchyard, determined to catch any midnight visitor who might return to the grave. But Miss Marple stayed in her cottage, knitting by lamplight, her thoughts turning over carefully. She remembered the typewriter, the ghostly confessions, the niece's overwrought outburst. It was too neat, too loud. Real guilt was quieter, more deliberate. Near midnight, a knock came at her door. She opened it to find young Tommy Briggs, the local errand boy, pale and frightened. "Please, Miss Marple," he stammered. "I didn't know where else to go. I saw her. She was in the churchyard again. Digging." "Who, dear?" "Mrs. Latimer's companion. The one with the black veil. She had a lantern and was pulling at the earth like a mad woman." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. She wrapped her shawl about her shoulders. "Come, Tommy. You've done well. Now let us see where truth leads when it thinks no one is watching." They hurried to the churchyard, where the faint glow of a lantern flickered among the graves. There, bent low in feverish effort, was Mrs. Latimer's companion, Miss Fenton, the woman who had stood so quietly in the background, who fetched tea, who carried notes, who had seemed so ordinary. Miss Marple laid a hand gently on Tommy's arm. "Stay here, dear. Some truths must be approached alone." She stepped forward, her voice calm. "Good evening, Miss Fenton. A little late for gardening, don't you think?" The woman froze, then turned, her face half lit by the lantern. Her eyes were wild, her hands stained with soil. "You don't understand," she whispered hoarsely. "It was never for me. It was for him. Edgar wanted it so. The will. He trusted me to keep it safe. But she found it. She tried to destroy everything. I had to stop her." Miss Marple's heart gave a slow, sorrowful throb. "You killed Mrs. Latimer." Tears welled in Miss Fenton's eyes. She was going to burn the papers. She said Edgar was a fool, that the money belonged to family, not charity. I couldn't let her. I loved him too much to let her undo his wishes. Her voice broke, and she sank to her knees beside the open grave. "So I wrote the words. I made the typewriter speak. I thought if I made her seem the villain, no one would look at me. I only wanted to protect his memory." From the shadows, Inspector Craddock emerged, revolver drawn. "Well, madam, you've just written your final confession, and without a typewriter this time." Miss Fenton bowed her head, her hands trembling in surrender. Miss Marple sighed softly, her eyes filled not with triumph, but with the melancholy of understanding. "Love is a powerful thing, Inspector. It builds, but it also blinds. In this case, it blinded a woman to the difference between devotion and destruction." As they led Miss Fenton away, the grave stood open under the moonlight, no longer silent. It had spoken at last, revealing not only Edgar's will, but the will of those who had lived and killed in his shadow. Miss Marple turned once more to the ivy-clad headstone, whispering quietly to the night, "Rest now, Edgar. Your secret is no longer buried." Chapter 14. The Vanishing Ink. The morning after the grave's revelation, St. Mary Mead was alive with whispers, though many dared not speak them aloud. Miss Marple, as usual, moved quietly through the village, her keen eyes noting the unremarkable and the overlooked, the sort of details that most people considered ordinary. But in mysteries, ordinary things rarely remain so. At the Grange, the atmosphere was tense yet strangely hollow. The house had been stripped of its secret, Edgar Ray's will, but it had left behind an intangible residue, like a scent that lingers after the perfume is gone. The typewriter sat on its stand, innocuous yet menacing in its silence. Miss Marple's sharp eyes were drawn to it the moment she entered the study. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Mr. Carroway said, his tone cautious, almost wary. "I suppose you know everything now." "I know enough," she replied, inspecting the typewriter. "Yet some questions remain. For instance, the ink you've been using. How is it that it seems inconstant?" Carroway frowned. "Inconstant?" "Yes," Miss Marple continued, leaning closer. "Yesterday, I observed that certain words on these pages faded almost before my eyes. Entire lines disappear if one does not read quickly. Do you know why?" He shook his head, perplexed. I assumed it was just old ink." Miss Marple tapped the page delicately. "Old ink behaves differently. It doesn't vanish selectively. Someone has been employing chemical tricks. Something in the ink causes it to disappear, leaving only what they wish to remain." Carroway's face paled. "So you think someone's tampering with my work?" "I do," Miss Marple said simply. "But they are clever. They understand not only chemistry but also the psychology of fear. By making the typewriter appear ghostly, they shift suspicion away from themselves." The idea that a human hand, not a ghost, was orchestrating these events did not surprise her. She had spent a lifetime observing human folly. Greed, ambition, and fear were better motivators than any spirit. That evening, Miss Marple returned alone to the study. By the lamplight, she examined the typewriter, turning the keys over gently. Each one clicked with precise mechanics, but the spacing and alignment of the letters were slightly irregular, as though someone had rekeyed it in secret. She retrieved a magnifying glass and scrutinized the paper. Indeed, faint traces of vanished ink remained, a ghostly residue that only a trained eye could detect. Her mind wandered back to the events of the previous days. The niece's dramatic confession, Miss Fenton's desperate vigil, and the hidden will. It all pointed toward a single conclusion: manipulation. Someone had exploited superstition and fear to achieve a personal aim. The typewriter was merely a tool. Suddenly, the paper shifted in her hand. A thin line of ink reappeared, forming words she had not expected. "Seek the cabinet beneath the floorboards." Miss Marple's heart quickened. She rose, inspecting the floor. The study was ordinary in most respects: a carpet worn from years of footsteps, bookshelves lined with fading volumes, and portraits of long-dead family members staring impassively. Yet, beneath the carpet, she found a rectangular outline, cleverly disguised. With practiced hands, she lifted the boards, revealing a small, dust-filled cabinet. Inside, papers were stacked haphazardly, yellowed with age. Among them, a notebook caught her attention. Its cover was embossed with the initials E.W., Edgar Ray himself. She opened it carefully. The pages were filled with neat, meticulous writing, detailing observations, correspondences, and financial transactions. But one section drew her attention more than the rest. In faint pencil, almost invisible, were notes about the typewriter. Edgar had anticipated someone might try to use it against him. He had prepared invisible ink formulas and secret instructions for deciphering them. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Edgar Ray had been clever in life, but more clever still in death. "So it was all planned," she murmured. The vanishing ink, the ghostly typewriter. It was a game, a final test of character. Her reflections were interrupted by a soft sound. She looked up and saw Carraway standing hesitantly in the doorway. "I thought I'd check on you," he said. I wanted to see if there was more to this." Miss Marple gestured toward the cabinet. "There is always more. Edgar Ray left puzzles behind, and now we see why. But the question is, who has been using these puzzles for mischief?" Carraway's brow furrowed. I don't understand. You mean, someone else has been here?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "And not only here. They have knowledge of chemistry, handwriting, and human psychology. They knew precisely how to frighten and mislead. And the messages, the typewriter itself, was merely a lure." For the next hour, they examined the cabinet, carefully noting the faded traces of ink, cross-referencing the pages with Edgar's notes. Miss Marple's mind worked methodically, connecting threads that others would overlook. The selective fading of letters, the peculiar alignment of words, the way the messages seemed almost too perfectly timed. By the time Carraway departed, promising to secure the cabinet, Miss Marple had formulated a plan. Whoever was behind the ghostly typewriter would return, tempted by curiosity or greed. When they did, she would be ready, not merely to observe but to catch them in the act. That night she prepared the study. A single page of the typewriter was left in place, the ink treated with Edgar's special formula, designed to reveal itself only under careful scrutiny. Then she retreated to the adjacent room, a warm lamp illuminating her face, her knitting resting idle in her lap. Midnight came and passed. The house was silent save for the creak of old floorboards and the soft wind rattling the windows. Miss Marple waited patiently, her keen eyes scanning the doorway. Then a shadow moved, a subtle, deliberate figure, bending low toward the typewriter. Miss Marple's heart quickened with anticipation. The culprit was at last revealed, caught in the act by the very tool they had so carefully manipulated. The vanishing ink had done its work. It had revealed not only secrets but character, and now the final act was about to unfold. Chapter 15: The Hidden Tunnel. The shadow bent low over the typewriter, gloved fingers reaching to pull the page Miss Marple had carefully prepared. The faint lamplight caught the intruder's profile, a tall figure, thin, with a nervous quickness to every movement. Miss Marple watched silently from the adjoining room, her sharp eyes glinting. The intruder leaned close, reading the lines of vanishing ink that only now shimmered into view. "Seek beneath the hearth where the tunnel breathes." The figure stiffened, then quickly rolled the page into a coat pocket. That was all Miss Marple needed. She rose quietly and stepped forward. "An interesting instruction, is it not?" The figure spun around. Mr. Carroway, the estate steward. His face was pale, his hands trembling. "Miss Marple," he stammered. You shouldn't be here." "But I am," she interrupted gently, knitting needles in hand as if they were her weapon of choice. "And you, Mr. Carroway, have just revealed yourself. Not by words, but by action. You have been manipulating this entire household. Ghostly typewriter and all." Carroway's jaw tightened. "You can't prove it." "Oh, but I can," Miss Marple said softly. "You see, only someone with access to Edgar Ray's private notes could have concocted the vanishing ink trick. Only someone who knew the hidden cabinet existed could tamper with it. And only someone who moved freely through this house without suspicion could stage the nightly hauntings." Carroway's hand twitched toward the hearth. "You don't understand." Miss Marple's voice sharpened. "Oh, I understand far more than you imagine. Edgar trusted you. You were his steward, his confidant. But when you discovered his fortune was left to charity, you felt cheated. You thought yourself the rightful heir, not by blood, but by loyalty. So you buried the truth, turned suspicion on others, and sought to claim the estate by fear." Carroway's lips curled in a bitter smile. "Clever old woman. But if you're so clever, perhaps you'd like to see what Edgar really left behind. The tunnel, it's the true heart of this mystery." Before she could stop him, he pressed against the hearthstone. With a low groan, a section of the fireplace shifted, revealing a dark, yawning passage. A gust of stale air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of earth and time. Carroway snatched a lantern from the table. "Follow me if you dare." Miss Marple, though frail in appearance, had never been one to shrink from danger when truth beckoned. "Very well," she said calmly. "But remember, Mr. Carroway, the tunnel that hides may also reveal." The passage descended steeply, walls of cold stone pressing in. Their footsteps echoed as they moved deeper, lantern light casting long, shivering shadows. The air was damp, filled with the faint drip of unseen water. At length, the tunnel widened into a small underground chamber. Dust lay thick on the floor, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted recent disturbances. Footprints, shifted stones, fragments of cloth. In the center stood an old wooden chest, bound with iron. Carroway set the lantern down and knelt beside it. His hands shook as he forced the chest open. Inside, stacks of ledgers and parchment lay piled high, brittle with age. On top rested a velvet pouch. Carroway opened it reverently, revealing a cascade of glittering jewels. "Edgar's fortune," he whispered, eyes gleaming. "Not the money. The jewels. He never trusted banks. He left it all here hidden. And now it's mine." Miss Marple's voice was quiet, but cutting. "And how many lives have you ruined to keep this secret, Mr. Carroway? Mrs. Latimer, the niece, poor frightened Fenton. You wove them into your scheme, sacrificing each as it suited you. A fortune built not on loyalty, but betrayal." Carroway's hands closed possessively over the jewels. "I earned this. Decades of service, of keeping his affairs in order. And in the end, he left it to strangers, children he never met. I couldn't allow it. This is justice." Miss Marple stepped closer, her expression grave. "No, Mr. Carroway. This is greed. And greed, like a tunnel, only leads deeper into darkness." At that moment, a voice rang out from the tunnel's mouth. "Step away from the chest, Carroway." Inspector Craddock emerged, revolver in hand, 2 constables at his back. His face was set with grim satisfaction. "We've heard enough. You've trapped yourself in your own labyrinth." Carroway's face twisted in despair. "She tricked me," he shouted, pointing at Miss Marple. "She lured me here." Miss Marple folded her hands serenely. "No, Mr. Carroway. Your own ambition lured you. I merely followed where your guilt led." The constable secured the chest, and Craddock clapped irons on the steward. Carroway sagged, defeated, his dream of riches crumbling into dust. As they led him away, Miss Marple lingered in the chamber, gazing at the forgotten chest. The jewels sparkled faintly in the lantern light, beautiful yet cursed. She shook her head gently. "Human folly," she murmured. always digging tunnels to hide what cannot remain hidden. When she finally emerged into the night air, the stars above seemed impossibly clear. The Grange stood silent behind her, its secrets laid bare at last, or so it seemed. But Miss Marple knew better. Mysteries seldom ended with a single arrest. There were always more shadows in the corners, more truths buried beneath the surface. And the ghostly typewriter, silent for now, might yet have one last tale to tell. Chapter 16. The Widow's Secret. The arrest of Mr. Carraway should have brought closure to the case, yet Miss Marple sensed the air of the Grange remained unsettled. The servants still whispered of footsteps in the halls, and in the village, people spoke of the house as though it were cursed. Greed had been exposed, yes, but greed rarely stood alone. It was often accompanied by something deeper, more personal. On the morning after Carraway's capture, Miss Marple walked to the rectory for tea with Reverend Pritchard's wife. Mrs. Pritchard, a plump, kindly woman, poured generously and said in a hushed tone, "It's dreadful business, Miss Marple. But between us, I don't think Mr. Carraway was clever enough to do all this. A dishonest man, certainly. But to plan such deceptions? I dare say someone else was behind it." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Indeed, my dear. You have a very shrewd instinct. Carraway may have dug tunnels and hidden jewels, but the typewriter tricks, the vanishing ink, those required a subtler mind." That thought stayed with her as she left the rectory. She walked through the village, observing faces, listening to fragments of conversation, as if piecing together a tapestry. Every so often, her eyes turned toward the figure of Mrs. Latimer's widow, Beatrice Latimer, who had remained strangely quiet through the entire ordeal. Mrs. Latimer was not a woman easily overlooked. Tall, elegant, always dressed in morning black despite her relative youth. She carried herself with a composure that bordered on icy. Yet Miss Marple had observed, on several occasions, the slightest tremor in her hand, the faint quickening of her breath when Edgar Ray's name was mentioned. That afternoon, Miss Marple called upon her. The drawing-room was dim, curtains half drawn, a faint scent of lavender in the air. Mrs. Latimer received her with the cool politeness of a woman accustomed to being obeyed. "You have come to pry, I suppose," she said without preamble. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Not pry, my dear. Only to listen. You see, I've found over the years that when people keep secrets, it's less from malice than from fear. And fear, once spoken aloud, loses much of its power." Mrs. Latimer's lips tightened, but she did not reply at once. Instead, she poured tea with deliberate precision, as though the ritual itself gave her strength. Miss Marple sipped politely, then said, "It was you who first found Edgar's grave disturbed, was it not? Long before Carraway came sniffing after jewels." The widow's hand faltered, spilling a drop of tea onto the saucer. Yes," she admitted reluctantly. "I did. But what of it? I thought it some village boy's mischief. Nothing more." Miss Marple's eyes were kind, but piercing. "You thought much more, Mrs. Latimer. You knew something lay hidden there. Something Edgar entrusted. Not to his steward, not to his niece, but to you." For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the mantel clock. Then, with a sigh heavy as stone, Mrs. Latimer spoke. "You are right, Miss Marple. Edgar told me years ago about the will and the jewels. He said he trusted no one but me. He asked me to guard them, to ensure his wishes were fulfilled. And I swore I would." Her eyes glistened, but her voice remained steady. "But when the time came, I faltered. The money meant for charity could have saved me from ruin. Do you know what it is to live in grandeur and see it all slip away? I was desperate. I thought perhaps I could take a portion. Who would know?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "So you turned a blind eye when others schemed. You let Carraway play his part, knowing he would take the blame. And you, what was your part, dear?" Mrs. Latimer's composure cracked then. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her shoulders trembling. "The typewriter," she whispered. "It was me. I wrote the first messages. Not Carraway. Not the niece. Me. I thought, if I frightened them enough, they would leave, and the fortune would remain untouched until I could decide what to do. But then it grew beyond me. Carraway grew greedy, Fenton grew desperate, and the niece, well, she was a fool. I never wanted bloodshed, Miss Marple. I only wanted to survive. Miss Marple reached across the table and laid her hand lightly upon the widow's trembling fingers. And yet blood was spilled. Secrets, once whispered, have a way of echoing louder than we intend. At that moment the door opened, and Inspector Craddock stepped in. He had been waiting in the hall, as Miss Marple had arranged. Mrs. Latimer rose, dignity returning to her frame. So it is to be the widow's shame, then. Very well. Arrest me if you must. I will not protest. Craddock hesitated, looking toward Miss Marple. But Miss Marple shook her head slowly. No, Inspector. Mrs. Latimer has confessed enough to her conscience. The law must weigh her actions, yes, but remember she did not strike the blow. She merely played with shadows. Shadows are dangerous, but they are not always the hand that kills. The widow bowed her head, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. When Miss Marple departed, the evening sun slanted across the village, bathing it in a golden glow. She walked slowly, reflecting on what she had learned. The ghostly typewriter had not belonged to one hand, but to many. It was a chorus of greed, fear, and love twisted into deceit. Each had touched the keys, each had left their mark. And yet Miss Marple knew the story was not over. The tunnel, the jewels, the widow's secret, they were chapters in a larger tale. Somewhere the typewriter still waited, its final message unwritten. Chapter 17. The Final Manuscript. The village of St. Mary Mead had not known such restless nights in years. Even after the widow's confession, whispers lingered like mist along the hedgerows. The idea that a respectable lady of the parish had conspired in ghostly deception unsettled the townsfolk more than any jewel theft. And yet, to Miss Marple's mind, there remained a final piece missing. It came to her in the smallest of ways, as it often did. She had been knitting in her parlor when her ball of yarn rolled beneath a cabinet. Reaching for it, she noticed a slip of old paper tucked in the shadows, a note she had once scribbled about Edgar Ray's peculiar obsession with his typewriter. The words returned to her with sudden clarity. A man does not speak to paper unless he intends it to outlive him. Outlive him. What if Edgar had left behind not only a will, but a manuscript, a confession, or perhaps a tale woven from truth and disguise? The next morning, Miss Marple requested Inspector Craddock's company at the Grange once more. He was reluctant. We've dug up enough secrets to last a decade, ma'am. But Miss Marple's insistence was unshakable. Together, they descended into the tunnels beneath the house, lanterns casting long, quivering shadows. Dust thickened in the air, and the stones seemed to groan with age. They reached the chamber where the jewels had been discovered, but Miss Marple did not linger there. She traced her fingers along the walls, lightly tapping until her ear caught a hollow sound. Here, she murmured. Craddock pried away a loose stone, and behind it lay a narrow cavity sealed with waxed cloth. Within, wrapped in oilskin, rested a bundle of papers tied with twine. Craddock whistled low. Well, I'll be. What have we here? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. The final manuscript. They carried it upstairs to the drawing-room. Carefully, Miss Marple untied the brittle twine, unfolding sheets yellowed with time but neatly typed in Edgar Ray's precise hand. The first page bore the title, The Ghostly Typewriter, A Confession. Craddock read aloud. To whomsoever finds these words, know that what you uncover is both fiction and truth. I, Edgar Ray, a man of pride and folly, have written my sins into story, for story may outlast judgment. I have deceived, I have hidden, I have sought to command even from beyond the grave. Yet my greatest crime was not against law but against love. Miss Marple leaned forward, her knitting forgotten. The manuscript unfolded as a strange blend of autobiography and Gothic tale. Edgar confessed to creating the myth of the ghostly typewriter himself. He had planted the first messages years ago, using vanishing ink and clever contraptions. It was a game, a performance, meant to unsettle his heirs and amuse his solitude. But beneath the theatrics lay something darker. Edgar revealed that the jewels were never his to bequeath. They had been entrusted to him by a friend fleeing scandal, treasures that should have been returned. Instead, Edgar kept them, weaving lies to conceal his theft. And then came the most shocking admission. To Beatrice Latimer I gave my heart, though it was never returned. She was the only one I trusted with the secret of the jewels, for trust bound to unrequited love is often stronger than trust bound to kinship. If she falters, know that my ghost walks not by curse, but by consequence. Craddock set the pages down, his brow furrowed. So he staged half the haunting himself? Blast it, the man was his own tormentor. Miss Marple's voice was soft. Not entirely. Others merely continued the play after he was gone. But it began with him, with vanity, pride, and a twisted longing to be remembered. She turned another page. The last was not a confession but a warning. A typewriter cannot lie. Keys strike truth, though the hand may tremble. To those who seek these jewels I say, look not at the treasure but at the tale. For the tale will damn you long before the law does. Silence filled the room. Outside, a rook cawed, and the clock ticked toward the hour. Finally, Miss Marple folded the manuscript. You see, Inspector, this is not evidence of crime so much as evidence of folly. Let it be archived, not destroyed. Stories teach where judgments cannot. Craddock grunted. I suppose the Crown will have its say. But you're right, ma'am. This explains much. The widow, Carraway, even the niece, they were players in a script Edgar himself had written. Miss Marple gave a small nod, though her eyes carried a weight of sadness. Yes. And like many playwrights, he did not live to see the tragedy his script would inspire. That evening she returned home, weary yet restless. She placed her knitting aside and sat at her writing desk. For a long while she stared at the blank page, the soft lamplight flickering. Then she began to write, not an official report, not a police statement, but her own account. A quieter manuscript. She titled it simply, On the Folly of Ghosts. Her pen moved swiftly, each word a thread stitching sense into madness. And as she wrote, the village bells told the hour, echoing through St. Mary Mead. Somewhere, she fancied, Edgar Ray might be listening still, his ghostly typewriter silenced at last. Chapter 18, Shadows at the Grange. The manuscript's discovery ought to have drawn the curtain upon the affair. Inspector Craddock was satisfied. More than satisfied, in fact. We've got our culprit, our confession, and the missing jewels, he told Miss Marple with a relieved sigh. I should think Scotland Yard will finally let me sleep a whole night through. But Miss Marple, ever alert to the tone beneath words, did not rest so easily. She had learned over many years that stories seldom end when people want them to. They end when they must. And the Grange, with its creaking staircases and whispered corridors, still held shadows that had not yet been explained. The following evening, she took her knitting to the drawing room of the Grange. The house was not hers, but Mrs. Latimer, worn and subdued after her confession, had consented to her presence. If it gives you comfort to sit here, Miss Marple, by all means. But I assure you the house is empty now of secrets. Miss Marple smiled gently. My dear, houses are like people. They do not easily give up the habits of a lifetime. A house used to secrecy will keep whispering until someone listens. She sat quietly for hours, her needles clicking, ears tuned not to the sound of yarn but to the subtler stirrings of the Grange. At 10:30, when the fire had burned low, she heard it, the faint rattle of keys like a typewriter striking in haste. Her eyes narrowed. The manuscript was locked away at the station. The typewriter itself had been placed under seal. And yet, the sound continued, faint but insistent, as though the ghost of Edgar Ray were still writing his confession. She rose, following the noise through the hall and into the old study. The room smelled of dust and old leather. Moonlight pooled across the desk where Edgar's typewriter had once sat. But the machine was gone, carted off by the police. Still, the sound persisted. Click, click, click. Miss Marple moved to the far corner, her fingers brushing the wall. A draft seeped through a crack in the paneling. She pressed lightly, and the panel swung open with a groan, revealing a narrow crawlspace. Inside sat another typewriter, an older model, rusty and stiff, but functional. A fresh sheet of paper was rolled into its carriage, and upon the sheet were words, half finished, as though someone had just fled the room. The jewels are not the end. Look deeper and you will see the hand. Miss Marple bent closer, examining the ink. It was fresh, still damp. Someone had been here within minutes. Behind her, a floorboard creaked. She turned swiftly, but the study was empty. Only shadows watched from the corners. The next morning, she summoned Inspector Craddock back. He stared at the hidden typewriter, dumbfounded. Another one. But we searched the study from top to bottom. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. And yet, Inspector, you searched for treasure, not for truth. There's always one more corner left unswept. Craddock rubbed his temples. So someone else is still at work. But who? Caraway's in custody, the widow has confessed, and the niece has fled the country. Miss Marple touched the unfinished words on the page. Someone who fears discovery, Inspector. Someone who knows that Edgar's tale is not complete. Shadows move in this house still. That night, the Grange seemed to brood under the weight of her words. Servants muttered that they saw figures at windows, though no one stood there. Dogs barked at the hedgerows. And Mrs. Latimer, pale as parchment, confessed that she heard footsteps pacing the corridor outside her room. Miss Marple did not laugh off such tales. Instead, she stayed once more in the study, knitting in the corner by the hidden typewriter. Hours crept by. Midnight struck. At last, the sound returned. Keys clicking, soft but frantic. Miss Marple rose and, without switching on the lamp, peered into the crawlspace. The typewriter moved, keys striking, paper shifting, but no human hand touched it. For an instant, even Miss Marple's steady heart faltered. Then her sharp eyes caught the truth, a thread fine as spider silk, strung across the keys and through the wall. Clever mechanics, hidden weights. Someone had set a contraption to mimic the ghostly typewriter. But why? And to what end? She examined the new page. This time, the words were clearer. The manuscript lies, the jewels deceive. The final key is blood. Miss Marple folded the page into her handbag, her mind racing. Someone wanted the legend of the ghostly typewriter to continue. Someone who profited from confusion, who thrived on fear. When Inspector Craddock arrived the next morning, she showed him the page. His jaw tightened. This isn't over, then. Someone still plays the game. Miss Marple looked out at the mist curling over the Grange's gardens. Her voice was calm, but resolute. No, Inspector. This is the shadow's last act. And when shadows grow this long, the dawn is never far behind. Chapter 19. The Dawn of Truth. The Grange had grown heavier with each passing night, as if the stones themselves had absorbed the fear of its inhabitants. Villagers gave it a wide berth, muttering of curses and spirits, while the servants refused to remain after dusk. Yet Miss Marple lingered, her quiet presence a lantern in the gloom. She knew the truth was near, hovering just beyond reach, and she would not leave until it was caught. The morning after the typewriter contraption was discovered, Inspector Craddock returned with renewed determination. "I've posted men at every exit," he said grimly. "If someone's been slipping in to feed the charade, we'll have them." But Miss Marple shook her head. "Not slipping in, Inspector. Living within. The Grange is a labyrinth, with corners forgotten even by its mistress. Whoever keeps this play alive has never left it." Craddock frowned. "You think a servant's involved?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Not quite. Servants gossip, and gossip leaves trails. No, this is someone clever enough to keep silence, someone whose presence raises no suspicion." As if summoned by fate, Beatrice Latimer entered then, pale but composed. She asked if she might sit with them, for she had not slept. Her eyes carried the weariness of a woman who had long borne secrets. Miss Marple regarded her kindly, yet with searching gaze. "Mrs. Latimer," she said gently, "when Edgar Ray entrusted you with knowledge of the jewels, did he not also entrust you with knowledge of something darker?" The widow's lips trembled. She looked away, toward the window where dawn spilled pale light across the gardens. "He told me things no woman should have to hear. His cruelties, his lies, his theft. I thought if I kept silent, they would die with him." Miss Marple's voice softened. But silence is a seed, my dear. It grows in the dark until it breaks through the floorboards. At that moment, a commotion arose in the hall. A constable burst in, breathless. "Inspector, we've found something. In the West Wing." They followed him through twisting corridors seldom used, where dust lay thick and curtains hung like cobwebs. At the end of the passage, a small door stood ajar. Inside was a cramped chamber, lined with shelves of papers, letters, and faded ledgers. But what drew their eyes was the figure seated at a desk. Simon Fenton, the solicitor, pale and disheveled, his eyes wild. Before him sat yet another typewriter, its keys ink-stained, its paper half-filled with words. Craddock leapt forward. "Fenton, what devilry is this?" The man gave a broken laugh. "Devilry? No, Inspector. Justice. Edgar's justice. He demanded his tale be told, and I am merely the messenger." Miss Marple stepped closer, her calm presence stilling the air. "You were the one who built the contraptions. You staged the ghostly writings after his death. Why, Mr. Fenton?" The solicitor's hands shook as he clutched the desk. "Because he commanded it. In his letters none of you ever saw. He wrote that the jewels, the will, the manuscript were not enough. His story must live, must breathe, must haunt. I was his servant as much in death as in life." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "No, Mr. Fenton. You were not his servant. You were his victim. Edgar's pride ensnared you as it did the widow, as it did Carroway. But you kept the game alive, hoping perhaps that his shadow would shield your own misdeeds." Fenton's face twisted. "Misdeeds? I sought only to honor his wishes." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, you sought to protect yourself. You feared discovery, that in your years as solicitor you had skimmed from accounts, altered records, stolen quietly in ways Edgar himself would have admired. You feared the manuscript might reveal you. So you created more pages, more hauntings, to bury the truth beneath confusion." Silence followed. Fenton's lips parted, then closed again. His eyes flickered with guilt. Inspector Craddock placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "That's enough. You'll answer for this in London." But Miss Marple raised a hand. "One moment, Inspector. There is still a truth we have not yet spoken." She turned to Mrs. Latimer. "My dear, you said Edgar told you things no woman should hear. Did he tell you, perhaps, that the jewels were never his to keep? That they were stolen from another?" Beatrice's eyes widened, tears brimming. "Yes, he did. He swore me to secrecy, said it was his greatest shame. He begged me to guard them, to keep silence for his sake. And I obeyed, for I loved him once, though I despised him in the end." Miss Marple's voice was grave. "Then the dawn of truth is this. Edgar Ray was not merely a cruel man with a love of games. He was a thief, and his legacy was built upon deceit. Those who served him in life became prisoners of his lies in death. The ghostly typewriter was never his spirit. It was the echo of greed and fear." The room seemed to exhale then, as though the Grange itself had long awaited the words. Craddock straightened, his expression firm. "Well, that settles it. Fenton will face charges. The jewels will be returned. And perhaps now this cursed house will find peace." Miss Marple did not reply at once. She touched the dusty typewriter on the desk, her eyes distant. Finally she said, "Peace, Inspector, comes not from justice alone, but from truth spoken plainly. And now the truth has been laid bare, even if it is an ugly one." As they led Fenton away, dawn broke fully over the gardens. Light streamed through the windows, scattering the shadows that had clung so long to the Grange. Birds sang, tentative at first, then with full-throated joy. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, gazing at the rising sun. In her heart, she knew the tale was nearly done. Only one chapter remained, the chapter of reckoning, of tying loose ends into a thread of meaning. She gathered her knitting and her handbag, and with quiet steps, she left the Grange to its awakening. Chapter 20. Curtain Falls. The village of St. Mary Mead awoke to a curious stillness the morning after Simon Fenton's arrest. For weeks, the Grange had loomed over the parish like a storm cloud, its whispers and shadows infecting even the most practical of minds. But now, with dawn spilling golden light over its gables, it looked less like a haunted mansion and more like a weary house ready to sleep. In the vicarage garden, Mrs. Pritchard clipped roses, remarking to her husband that the curse had finally lifted. In the post office, Mr. Larkin told anyone who would listen that he had always suspected the solicitor. And in the high street, the butcher joked that business would improve now that people had stopped peering over their shoulders at phantoms. Yet for Miss Marple, the affair was not quite finished. She sat in her modest parlor, knitting set aside, papers spread before her. Edgar Ray's manuscript, the widow's confession, Fenton's typed threats, and her own quiet notes. Each sheet was a fragment of a larger pattern, and she was determined to stitch them into a whole. Inspector Craddock called upon her that afternoon, hat in hand, looking rather more human than usual now that the case was nearly closed. "Well, Miss Marple," he said with a smile, "I suppose I owe you thanks once again. Without your sharp eyes, I dare say I'd still be chasing shadows." Miss Marple poured him tea, her manner gentle. "Oh, Inspector, shadows are very important. They tell us where the light must fall." He chuckled. "And what light have you found now?" Miss Marple tapped the manuscript. That Edgar Ray, for all his theatrics, was at heart a frightened man. He feared irrelevance more than death. That is why he built his ghostly stage. But the others, Carraway, the widow, Fenton, they each added their own lines to the play. A ghost does not exist until enough people believe in it. Craddock nodded slowly. So the ghostly typewriter was never one man's creation, but everyone's? Precisely, Miss Marple said. A collaboration of greed, guilt, and silence. The typewriter struck its keys only because each of them, in their way, pressed upon it. There was a quiet knock at the door then. Beatrice Latimer entered, dressed still in black, though her veil was lifted. She looked less a grand widow now and more a woman humbled by grief. "I came to thank you, Miss Marple," she said softly. "You have freed me, though at terrible cost. The truth is a heavy burden, yet lighter than the chains of secrecy." Miss Marple rose and took her hand. "My dear, the truth always demands a price. But you have paid yours, and now you may begin again." Beatrice's eyes glistened. "I shall leave the Grange. It holds too many memories. Perhaps in London I might find peace." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Peace, yes. But remember, my dear, peace comes not from forgetting, but from forgiving. Begin with yourself." When she had gone, Craddock exhaled deeply. "So that's the end of it. The widow to London, Fenton to prison, Carraway awaiting trial. And the jewels? Well, the Crown will decide their fate. What will you do now, Miss Marple?" She smiled faintly, gathering her knitting once more. "What I always do, Inspector. Tend to my garden, visit my friends, and wait for the next story to come knocking. Life is never still, you know. It only pauses long enough for us to take a breath." That evening, Miss Marple walked alone to the Grange one final time. The great house stood silent, its windows dark, its doors locked. She wandered through the overgrown garden, listening to the rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. At the study window she paused. The moonlight cast her reflection against the glass. For a fleeting instant she fancied she saw another figure beside her, the outline of a man at a typewriter, fingers poised, waiting. But when she blinked, the reflection was gone. Miss Marple chuckled softly to herself. "Well, Edgar, curtain down at last. Your play is finished. And if you are listening still, I hope you know, you were never quite as clever as you thought." With that she turned away, her footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Behind her, the Grange loomed, no longer haunted, but hushed, like a theater after the audience has left, curtains drawn, stage darkened, echoes fading into memory. Days later, the final reports were filed, the papers carried lurid headlines about the ghostly typewriter mystery, and the village slowly returned to its rhythm of teas, garden shows, and Sunday sermons. Children played once more near the gates of the Grange, daring each other to peer inside, though none stayed long. And in her quiet parlor, Miss Marple completed her own account, a slim notebook written in her neat hand. She titled it simply, Curtain Falls, An Account of the Grange Affair. She placed it upon her shelf among other such notebooks, each the record of a tale she had lived through, each a reminder that the human heart was more complex than any ghost story. With that done, she returned to her knitting, the click of her needles steady and comforting. Outside, the village bells rang the hour, and life in St. Mary Mead moved forward, as it always had and always would. The ghostly typewriter was silent forever.